Hi, welcome. And I don't have a microphone on, so can everyone hear me in the back? Okay, thank you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to the Olmsted County History Center for providing the venue for today's presentation. After the presentation, we hope you'll have time to join us in the Heirloom Garden at the History Center. Master Gardener Beth Platzer, who helps maintain the garden here, will be able to share a bit about the garden and answer any questions you have if you'd like to see Heirloom Seeds in action. My name is Carrie Ostby, and I'm one of the many people who have worked with the Seed Library at Rochester Public Library this year. We're wrapping up our first successful year where over 8,000 packets of seeds from the Seed Library have made their way into containers and garden plots in our community. Yay! Over 2,000 of those packets were items donated by local seed savers, too, so that's excellent, very generous. And while the Seed Library has closed for the season, there are still seed-saving classes you can take this fall. There's information over on the table over there. And we're also starting to plan for next year's Seed Library. So if you have any suggestions, you can write it on the clipboard over there of things you would like to see. If you have saved some vegetable or herb seeds this past year and want to share them with the Seed Library, go ahead and see me after the presentation. I can tell you how you can donate those. And the Seed Library and today's presentation were funded in part or in whole with money from Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. So we're very excited today to welcome Sara Straate, seed historian from Seed Savers Exchange in Decorah, Iowa. As a nonprofit, Seed Savers Exchange aims to conserve and promote America's culturally diverse but endangered garden and food crop heritage for future generations by collecting, growing, and sharing heirloom seeds and plants. Sara coordinates the Seed History Research Project, which is an ongoing effort to enhance the documentation of each variety in the Seed Savers Exchange collection. Today we're going to learn about the diversity of this collection through their heirloom seeds and their unique stories, which honor the garden stewards who preserve them through the generations. Welcome, Sara.
Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Does the volume sound good? Okay, wonderful. Well, as Carrie said, my name is Sara, and I've been with Seed Savers Exchange since 2011 as a seed historian. And in that time, it's been really fun to get to know the collection better and discover some of the many stories that are just part of the history, the stewardship history of the varieties that we maintain. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about some stories that really resonate with the work that we're doing and the projects going on at Seed Savers Exchange. But really, everything started with the story of two seeds that came to Iowa in 1884 when Michael and Margaret Ott immigrated to near Festina, Iowa, near St. Lucas, from Germany. And Michael and Margaret raised a family of 11 children, had a log cabin farmed in northeast Iowa, not too far from Decorah. And one of their sons, Baptiste John Ott, is the grandfather of our co-founder, Diane Ott Whaley. And the two seeds that his family brought were a Morning Glory and a pink tomato. They are varieties that Diane remembers from her childhood, that her grandparents were growing on the farm. And in the early 1970s, as a newlywed, Diane and her husband, Kent, were given seeds of both of these varieties from Grandma and Grandpa Ott. And that was a point at which Diane realized that there's this continuous chain of stewardship, and that now they were going to be continuing on the tradition into the future. But it also occurred to Kent and Diane that what if a particular family didn't have anyone to pass these seeds like this onto? There were a lot of home gardeners out there growing and maintaining varieties very dear and near to their hearts, but what if they didn't have anyone to share these seeds with? And ultimately, that's how the idea of Seed Savers Exchange was born. In 1975, Kent and Diane decided to advertise that they were looking to create a network of gardeners interested in growing and maintaining open pollinated varieties especially heirloom varieties, seeds that had been passed down maybe within a family or within a community. And the idea of creating this seed sharing and seed saving network came about. With Kent's journalism background, they put together an annual mailing which would contain the names and addresses of everyone who had responded to their initial plea for gardeners. And then everyone would receive this mailing and see the different types of vegetable seeds that other gardeners in other states were growing and that they had seeds available to share. So essentially, a nationwide seed swap, if you can imagine. That sounds better than the Christmas, toy catalog, in my opinion. But in the very first year, 29 people responded to this plea for gardeners. And one of those gardeners was Lina Cisco from southern Missouri. Lina had a pole bean in her collection, which had been passed down from her grandmother, who had come to Missouri in the 1880s when they were homesteading. And Lina is a classic example of someone who recognized the value in the seeds that she had and wanted to be able to share them with more people. Now, the initial excitement and response in the early years must have been pretty great, because after participating in the seed exchange for the first year or two, Lina actually got a little overwhelmed with the number of requests that she was receiving. And she went so far as to return one of Kent and Diane's letters with deceased written on the outside envelope, because she just could not handle all of the interest. So unfortunately, a number of people thought that she had actually passed away. But just within the last few years, a woman who was a girl, as a girl was a neighbor of Lina, remembered that it was kind of a humorous story when her own father went over to visit the Ciscos and said, "Lina, I saw your obituary in the Mother Earth News magazine the other day, but it looks like you're still here." Apparently, Lina was a little bit of a spitfire and reminded this particular gal a little bit of Granny from the Beverly Hillbillies. So it sounds like she had quite the fun personality, but was a very dedicated seed steward to have been growing this heirloom bean most of her adult life. Now, by the late 1970s, Kent and Diane had the good fortune to meet a gentleman from Massachusetts named John Withy. And John was a bean collector himself. He had started looking for heirloom varieties all because he wanted to locate the dry bean that he remembered his mother baking with when he was a boy, which happens to be the one in the upper left corner there called Jacob's Cattle. They had a tradition of making baked beans where you prepared them in a Dutch oven, and then on Friday night it was John's responsibility to clean out essentially an earthen oven, but it was a hole in the ground. He would light a fire. Once it had gotten hot, the Dutch oven of beans would be put in. The lid was on, because then you filled it back in with earth. And it baked all throughout Friday night, Saturday, and then Saturday night there would be baked beans for supper. And leftover baked beans on Sunday. And beans on mayonnaise sandwiches for the kids to take to school the following week. But funny, he says that he never actually got sick of beans, even though they ate them so frequently during his childhood of the 19-teens and 20s. But by the late 70s, John had been collecting beans for close to 15 years, and he was getting a little bit overwhelmed with this project because during that time he had managed to locate and receive over 1,100 different bean samples from people that he met, or from people who contacted him through the little advertisements that he was tacking up in grocery stores or in country general stores asking for home-saved heirloom varieties. Even though he had a small network of growers that were helping him to grow and increase seeds that they partially returned to him at the end of the season, it was still much more than he wanted to care for in his retirement years. So in 1981, John shared a portion of every variety in his collection with Kent and Diane. And at that point, the Whaleys really had a seed bank collection on their hands. This wasn't just trading seeds or swapping seeds through the mail anymore. It was a collection that was a huge honor, but also a huge responsibility to keep maintaining for the future. And if this gives you any kind of sense of the correspondence that the Whaleys had on their hands those first few years, this is probably also the extent of the office help that they had too. It started out as a very, very small two-person operation. Today, the seed bank collection numbers over 20,000 varieties. And here is an image of the walk-in freezer that we use for long-term storage. The seeds today are in packets that contain a foil lining, which provides a moisture barrier and allows us to keep the seeds, once they've been dried down, to keep them in a very cold and very dry environment. And we expect decades of viability with the seeds stored in this manner. So today, after over 40 years of growth with an interest in heirloom varieties, home-saved seeds, we identify our mission as being folks who conserve and promote the culturally diverse but endangered garden and food crop heritage for future generations by essentially collecting, growing, and sharing these different varieties. And the last part of that mission is essentially the actionable objectives that we have, that we are growing, that we're saving, and we are sharing seeds with whomever is interested, and the people that we can get interested and excited about gardening. Now, we're able to distribute seeds from our collection in a couple of different ways. A lot of folks are probably familiar with the annual catalog that we put out in usually December, and we have some copies up here on the table if you're interested in grabbing one. The catalog usually has about 600 varieties in total, many different crop types. It also contains, some recipes, some growing information, a few side notes and informational tidbits there. But if you're interested in being able to access seeds from the seed bank collection, I highly recommend that you investigate our exchange. And I have some informational brochures about it. I won't go in too deep about the exchange right now, but the exchange is still this network of gardeners. That first year when we had 29 people participation has actually grown pretty significantly. And in 2019, we had nearly 400 gardeners across the US and in some overseas countries who had seeds that they just wanted to share with folks and get them out there. So the exchange is basically our longest running educational program at Seed Savers Exchange. And we compile this listing in the fall every year. And for folks who request a paper copy, it gets mailed out shortly after the new year. But we also have an online interface today, which greatly helps with searching. If you're looking for something really specific, you can come up with a shorter list of results than paging through the entire book. This nationwide seed exchange, though, really is a community of many, many different seed keepers, because every gardener, whether you're growing one variety or 10 or over 1,000 like John Withy was, everybody is participating in seed preservation. And this is ultimately something that we hope we can excite more people about and create more garden stewards who are growing and maintaining and sharing seeds. Carrie was talking about the success of the seed library this past year, and that is all built upon the home gardens and gardeners who are dedicated to growing and sharing varieties. One variety in the seed bank collection, which you can access through the exchange, is a cowpea called the T.W. Martin Original Purple Hull Pea. And you might not think cowpeas would grow in Iowa or Minnesota, but they do. And what I find interesting about this particular variety is that a new participant in the exchange by the name of Lisa started to offer seeds and request seeds just a couple of years ago. But this particular cowpea caught her eye when she was paging through the exchange book here for the very first time. And I wrote down a quote of hers in some email correspondence from this past year because it was just spot on. She said, "Being the family genealogist, I knew right away this was my kinfolk. Abner Martin, pictured here on the slide, was first cousin to my great-grandfather, Jesse Martin. After growing out this cowpea when living in Indiana, I shared it with my aunt, who still resides in Mississippi. She grew it out and shared it with her first cousin, Kenny Martin. When Kenny saw the pea, he said, 'That's just the old Martin pea. We've been growing it forever.' So this cowpea made a 150-year trip from Smith County, Mississippi, to Louisiana, to Indiana, and back to Mississippi. Lisa boils them in salt water with a few small pods of okra and a spoon of bacon grease to eat this. It is a bush cowpea, and for us in Iowa, it was mid-season maturing. You can see that the seeds, it might not be very clear here, but they have a purplish blush to the seeds. So they're we call that a charismatic characteristic, a trait that is passed down with each generation of the cowpea. But I just couldn't believe it when I heard that a new participant in the exchange had actually found an old family heirloom belonging to her own family. So this is just one of those examples where having seed stewards carrying these seeds on for the future are going to be able to make them available to perhaps your own descendant, 3 times removed, second cousin. Now, the seed bank collection today numbers over 20,000 varieties I mentioned, and it contains over 100 different crops. Here are the largest 15 crops. As you can see, tomatoes dominate what is represented in our collection. We have over 6,000 varieties of tomatoes, over 5,000 varieties of beans, and a few that might surprise you. Some of the smaller type there includes garlic, lima bean, cowpea, watermelon, cucumber, melons, but also apples, peas, squash, lettuce. You can tell by the size of the crop, it seems to correlate to the popularity of the crop. Tomatoes and beans are very easy to grow. A lot of people like to eat them, and they're fairly easy to save seed from as well. The collection itself, while we've always acquired varieties with the general understanding that we're interested in old seeds, heirloom seeds, historic seeds, today there's 3 groups that we primarily focus on. Those historic commercial varieties, which would have been available from seed companies back in the day, prior to 1950. That's a date that we generally use in our own collection to distinguish between historic and modern. We're also interested in the family heirlooms. Those can be historic and modern. But then also modern day open pollinated varieties, maybe something that was introduced commercially but has really found a niche and has shown staying power in the marketplace. More modern commercial varieties that have been available for 35 years are another category of interest for us. But the seeds that have been traded in this exchange, those that have a history of being shared for over 20 years, those are really special to us as well, because the people participating in the seed exchange are really the heart of our organization and what we do. And we wanted to be able to recognize those varieties and the stewardship that they've had amongst the exchange. Now, the exchange has a number of different crops that we don't necessarily maintain at Seed Savers Exchange, or that we don't maintain in quite the manner that you would expect. We have several hundred different varieties of potato, but that's a lot of potatoes to actually plant out in the field and dig and store in a root cellar. So our entire potato collection is kept in tissue culture, in test tubes where we keep plantlets, essentially, that then periodically are removed, put into the field, bulked up so that we can share a few of our potatoes in the exchange every year. Grandpa Miller potato here is a relatively newcomer to the collection, and it was shared with us by a fellow named Mike Green from Oregon just 5 or 6 years ago. And Mike said that his grandmother, Loris, who's pictured in the center there, always just remembers that this potato was a staple in the family. Her parents grew it, her grandfather grew it. In fact, nobody quite knows when Grandpa Miller started to grow it, but Willis Miller was a gold miner in Oregon in the 1880s. And as far as the family remembers, this is a potato that he just always had. Now, lucky for him, he actually was able to make a go at gold mining, enough so that he was able to generate enough income to buy the farm that the family has kept in the family to this day. Before 1920, Reverend Frank Abbott was harvesting beans in his garden in Bolton, Connecticut, and he discovered some seeds that did not look like the seeds he had planted. There was something fishy going on. But he saved those aside and planted them the next year just to see, are these going to be different from the bean that I was growing? And it turns out that he suspects that the bees had cross-pollinated 2 different beans that he was growing in his garden. One of the parents was Kentucky Wonder, they're pretty sure, a historic commercial variety that has been around for well over 100 years. But the other parent, not quite sure what that bean might have been. So Connecticut Wonder was the name that Reverend Abbott came up with. He decided this new variety deserved a name of its own. And this is an image of Reverend Abbott's son, Freeland, circa about 1922, in the bean patch. I'm not sure how much of a help he is hoeing those beans there, but that's Kentucky Wonder behind him. As you can see, it's a pretty vigorous pole bean used as a snap bean. The seeds are a really rich shade of mahogany there. But we were able to connect with Freeland's daughter, Deborah, who was the person responsible for sharing this with John Withy back in the 1970s. And she shared a photo of her dad here. Just a treat to be able to see the faces of the people behind these varieties and those responsible for them. A lot of cultural history is essentially at the heart of the seed stories that we try to collect. So whenever possible, we are asking folks to consider sharing images, recipes. We want to know, how can this be eaten? That's my favorite part of being able to see all of the different seeds that we grow every year. But with a large collection like the one that we have, not allowing varieties to cross-pollinate is a pretty big concern. We want to be able to maintain these seeds in the way that they were shared with us, so we use the 890 acres of our farm to be able to spread out the gardens where we have different varieties planted. At the greatest distance, we can separate the gardens by a half a mile, which is necessary for some crops if you're not going to pollinate them by hand. Corn is one crop that we have to pollinate by hand because there's just too many cornfields surrounding us. But here are a few images of the isolation cages that we use. It is a mesh nylon, so the rain can get in, the sun gets in, the pollinators cannot get in. So we will actually raise from pupa houseflies, leafcutter alfalfa beetles, mason bees, and release those into the tents so that they do the pollinating that needs to happen, live out their lives in there, and then at the end of the season, we can go in and harvest. So the tents are approximately 6 feet high, pretty roomy. This year, though, we had a squash that was really starting to test the limits of the cage. It had begun to grow up the outer walls and slightly reaching around the top corners there. But some of the cages are like a shorter 25-foot length. Some of them are more like 40 feet. And we can sometimes put in more than one type of crop. So we could do a bean, a tomato, a pepper, and in a cage right next to it, another bean, tomato, pepper, and really maximize the footprint of the acreage that we have. Another aspect of collection management is being able to evaluate the varieties that we are growing. And a portion of what we grow every year is strictly grown for seed increase. So we are isolating those varieties. At the end of the season, we will be harvesting them, and the seed that is harvested will go back into the seed bank, or perhaps shared with our catalog staff, maybe make an appearance in the catalog in the future, or be sent out through the seed exchange in the form of distributions to gardeners across the country. But another portion of the varieties that we grow are strictly for us just to see, what does it look like? How big is it going to get? What color are these peppers when they're mature? What does it taste like? And the evaluation side allows us to also tell people, here's how you can expect it to perform in your garden. In 2019, in the awfully wet spring that we had, here's what we saw in Iowa. The two photos that are on the left are a couple of shots from a planting of many, many, many different types of collards from a couple of years ago. You might not expect a variety that is typically associated with the South to grow in a more northern climate, but they do phenomenally well here. And they are just as nutritious, if not more nutritious, as other leafy greens like kale and spinach. So it's something that I hope more people experiment with in the future. Our evaluation team of 2 will monitor about 400 to 500 of these different varieties grown strictly for evaluation every year, so that we can create pretty detailed descriptions that will be used in the seed exchange when those varieties are listed here and shared with other folks. Now, knowing what to expect when you are growing a variety is really important for our evaluation team, because they want to know, have we been maintaining the variety in the right way? Are we sure we haven't allowed it to cross-pollinate with another variety? And in the case of Wick's lima bean, we were a little concerned the first time we grew it, because we saw seeds at harvest time that were a combination of white with some black and purple mottling, but then other seeds that were completely black. They might be a little difficult to see there, but we were expecting a bit more uniformity with this lima bean. It came to us from the Thomas family of Sandyville, West Virginia. Helen and her husband, H. Lee, had been growing this lima bean that they received from H. Lee's grandfather, Wick B. Smith. And Wick B. Smith was a school teacher in Sandyville in a one-room schoolhouse. He was an avid gardener. The family is not entirely sure where this lima bean came from. Maybe it was something that he purchased. Maybe it was traded from another gardener. But Helen and her husband had been growing this for several decades. And when we were able to contact Helen and talk to her, she said, "Oh, that's fine. That's what it is supposed to look like." So we were able to rest assured that this was actually intentional. It was normal for the variety. And home-saved seeds often do have a little more variability because maybe 10 years ago, Grandma accidentally let it cross with another lima bean in the garden. But uniformity often isn't what people are looking for when they're saving seed. They're looking for taste and productivity and reliability. Is this going to perform well for me? So as you're saving seeds in the fall, you might selectively try to target the plants that were more productive than others, or if you are looking to improve the variety that you have and tinker with it a little bit, you can tailor to specific traits that you're looking for, and in time, fine-tune that variety closer to one that is representing all of the characteristics you're hoping to obtain. With seed stories, I have prepared a handout that's actually on the table, and I encourage you to take one if you're at all interested in learning more about the questions that we ask when we're reconnecting with donors, or maybe when we're talking with someone who has contacted us wishing to give seeds today for the collection. Because all the questions on the handout essentially boil down to these 3 topics. Tell me a little bit about the variety. What does it look like? What does it taste like? How does it grow? What kind of productivity? Is it early, mid, or late maturing perhaps? So just an overall picture of what the variety is supposed to look like. But then also, why have you been growing it? This is the question that I like to lead with. Why is it special to you? Because often that prompts people to talk about either a sentimental attachment they have to it, or to an earlier gardener who grew it, or perhaps this is simply the best tasting watermelon that they've ever had, and they know they can't find it anywhere else unless they grow it themselves. But also knowing more about the overall picture of the stewardship history, we call it, that chain of gardeners who have grown and saved and passed down the seed. We hope to learn who were those people, where did they live, maybe a little bit about their own gardens too. This particular watermelon, the Schockler watermelon, is from Texas and was developed by Joe Palmer Schockler sometime in the 1920s. It's a little hard to read, but that newspaper clipping at the very top is from a trade publication called the Chicago Packer. It was printed in Chicago and was kind of the, it kept the pulse of the fruit and vegetable industry. So Joe here was writing to the Chicago Packer to let everybody know how his 1925 crop was doing. He had planted over 700 acres of Schockler watermelon. Now, being in Texas, if he had a watermelon that shipped well, he could send it out of his area to other markets where watermelon weren't ripe yet and be able to sell it. And if you notice the rind on this watermelon, it is extremely thick. It was an excellent shipper. So he was able to take advantage of being able to move this product to another area where people would buy it. This pepper is originated perhaps a little closer to home with the Ogle-Rokelli family in Des Moines. The Ogle-Rokelli family donated this pepper to Seed Savers Exchange just 4 or 5 years ago. And it isn't entirely known whether or not the family brought it from Italy when they settled in Des Moines, but Grandma Teresa doesn't remember a time when her parents did not grow this pepper. Today she is in her 90s, and she herself still grows it. She has a couple of potted peppers on a windowsill in her home. But Grandma Teresa's father would take fried pepper sandwiches with him to work many days. He worked in Des Moines in a few different areas, a brick factory, the sanitation company in town. Interestingly enough, he actually never learned to speak English, but his grandchildren somehow still always understood what he was trying to communicate when they ended up only being able to speak English, but they still were able to communicate with Grandpa and know what he was saying. Grandma Teresa's grandson, Chad, is the boy pictured in the photo on the right here. He is making a savory roll with his grandfather, and in the center there we have just a little photo of the rolls. It is a roll that is made with anchovies, with a sauce that these peppers are created using, and the Ogle-Rakelli family has really kind of gone above and beyond to document the family's use and stewardship of this pepper by creating a recipe book of all the favorite recipes they like to make with it, including stuffed peppers, different types of pickled and canned peppers. And I would say that this particular pepper has achieved legendary status within the family. Everyone is extremely devoted to it. Now, another aspect of the collection that perhaps you have heard of is our relationship with the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is located off the coast of Norway on one of the Norwegian islands. This poppy came to our collection from Valeria Ducalo in Pennsylvania, and it's something that her mother brought from Romania when she immigrated to the US. The poppy is part of a recent shipment of seeds that we sent to Svalbard, which is strictly a black box storage facility. All of the seeds that are sent to Svalbard from many, many different seed banks around the world are kept on shelves in the side of this mountain in very cold temperatures, so that if some sort of disaster should happen at the site of the depositor, whichever country, wherever they're from, that particular organization can recall the box of seeds that they sent to Svalbard so that they can essentially start over. And Svalbard recently celebrated its 10th anniversary, and we typically send a deposit there once a year of about just one box that contains a couple hundred seeds. So if we have 20,000 varieties in our collection, we're going to keep making more and more deposits over time. Now, sometimes folks will call this the Doomsday Vault, but really it's not a global doomsday situation that would, it's a mini doomsday situation. If something should happen to our farm in Iowa, we're able to get the seeds back so that we can start over and rebuild our own collection. This also shows that we don't just have vegetables. We have flowers, herbs. We also have an apple collection at Heritage Farm. And it is just starting to come into fruit. So if you're looking for an excuse to come down, maybe the tomato tasting, which is in just a week or so, our historic apple orchard is another thing to check out.
So can I ask about the apples?
Sure.
If you plant an apple from an apple tree, you won't get the same species.
If
So
you,
how do you propagate them?
right. If you were to save the seeds out of an apple itself and plant that, the tree that's produced is going to be very different from the parent tree, because essentially every seed is a hybrid. It was pollinated with pollen from another apple. And at the farm, we will take cuttings from the newest growth on the shoot, something usually about the diameter of a pencil, and then we will purchase scion wood. That's the scion wood. We'll purchase the root stock, which essentially is a tree, only the roots and a little bit of the stem. And you essentially join them together. And that's the way to propagate apples if you want an identical tree to the one that you had. Now, being able to plant from seeds also means that that's the way new apple varieties are created. And historically, before propagation was widely done, that is the reason why we had nearly 20,000 different apple varieties in North America at one time. So today we have about 1,200 apples in our historic orchard, and it's really fun to be able to see the different shapes, colors, tastes. Some are extremely tart. Some should only be used for cider, and that's it. You do not want to eat it just out of hand. And a lot of different textures as well. Our orchard manager likes to say that if you're going to make a pie, don't use any fewer than 3 or 4 apples in it, because it'll just be so much more complex in flavor and texture.
Oh, 3 different, 4 varieties.
Varieties of apples.
Okay.
Yep.
So
We have scion wood from the orchard available through the exchange, but we also sell apple trees through our catalog. So there's a couple of different options. One of the more exciting newer projects that we have going on is a collaboration with the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, where we are beginning to identify indigenous varieties within our collection and rematriate those back to the communities that they came from. And you can think of rematriation as an alternative form of repatriation. Essentially, this honors the often female tradition of growing and caring for the vegetable gardens within the native communities. And last year, we had our the first year that we focused on identifying and growing a couple of dozen indigenous varieties, and we were able to send seeds and a squash, which was a treat, of the Taos Pueblo squash to the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico for a rematriation ceremony that they held last fall. And this, kind of brings everything full circle, because it's wonderful to have a seed bank where seeds are kept in a somewhat stable and safe environment, but ultimately they need to be in the hands of people who are growing them, are experiencing them, are connected to them. And being able to send seeds home to communities like this, or to gardeners, or to Lisa's family so that they can grow this cowpea again, that's really the reason behind everything that we're doing. If you haven't had a chance to visit the farm in Iowa, we have a couple of events yet this year, and there are postcards here up on the table with details and dates of information. But we are pretty much open to the public year-round, although our visitor center does close for the winter. But we have hiking trails, and in addition to the tomato tasting, which is coming up, and a fall festival, we have other events throughout the spring and summer. Most notably our summer conference, which is towards the end of July. It's not the same weekend as Nordic Fest, in case you're wondering about the crazy traffic and everyone in town. It's near there. But we're providing educational opportunities for folks to come and learn. There's typically an apple grafting workshop in the spring for anybody who try to get a little bit more familiar with that technique. And with we do tours as well to talk about the farm and what we're doing. And in actually just a week ago, we held our annual seed school, which is kind of an immersive 3-day workshop where participants come and learn some of the more intricacies of plant biology and seed saving. So it's a nice opportunity to really take a deep dive into all of that as well. For anyone who is interested particularly in seed saving and becoming a little bit more proficient at working with one crop or another, we recently published a manual called The Seed Garden, and there's a copy on the table over here to your right if you're interested in paging through it. Every crop is a little bit different. Every crop has a little bit, slightly different plant physiology, so there can be different tips and techniques that you need to try. If no one has started seed saving yet, beans are a very easy crop to begin with. If you don't mind a little bit of a mess, you can try your hand at tomatoes, because those seeds, after you extract them from the fruit, need to be fermented in water for a little while to break down the gelatinous coat that surrounds the seeds. That coat actually inhibits germination. It gets a little gross and a little smelly, but it doesn't last that long. So there are a lot of educational resources on our website too. The seed saving aspect, seed starting, or diving into cultural history, seed stories, seed histories as well. So we've also got some free seeds up here. Please take something. It's never too early to start planning for next year's garden. And I guess with that, I'll open it up for some questions. Yes? Well, there are some crops that need to be tricked into thinking they've experienced winter. And while I'm not sure if hibiscus is one of them, that might be something to try to research a little further. There are some seeds that actually need to experience freezing temperatures in order for an internal trigger of theirs to trip. And then they'll germinate after they've experienced that cold. Or sometimes seeds have such a hard seed coat that you need to actually physically like crack it or abrade it a bit so that the water can penetrate in. There could be a few different things going on. The seed might not have been mature, but if it felt dry and if it looked like it had reached the right stage to you, then it might take a little bit to figure out what's going on there. Yeah.
Hibiscus-like impatiens. Hibiscus-like impatiens needs 70-degree soil temperature.
Is it a hardy hibiscus or a tropical hardy? Oh, no. And say that again, what you said.
They need a 70-degree soil temperature to germinate.
Oh, okay.
This is sort of a personal thing. We would go to Seed Savers and been supporting it for a long time. But about 7, 8 years ago, I was down in the shop and I picked up a book about Nikolai Vavilov,
Mm-hmm.
who's the famous person. There were 2 of them, and I picked the right one. It was by Gary Nobbin. I've been back there a number of times, and they don't seem to have it. I would ask you to get it because it's such an important thing for a historian to propagate.
I appreciate the recommendation.
Yeah, no, they just don't seem to have it, and people there don't know, but you're a historian. You would understand how important that is.
Right. Yeah. Nikolai Vavilov was a Russian scientist and so extremely dedicated to what he was doing that during the I get the dates confused, but
He finished college in 1918, and the Russian Revolution was just happening. But he was the one who came up with the idea that seeds really came from high altitude. They had to be stressed. It wasn't from the river valley. You should read about him. It's absolutely wonderful. But he started this thing in what was then called Leningrad, And during the war, he was Stalin really supported him until he didn't.
mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
And then he was sent off to Siberia and he died of starvation there.
Mm-hmm.
But in this, in Leningrad, or St. Petersburg, this was pushed, or was surrounded. There was a siege for 900 days around Leningrad. And these people were starving. They were eating rats and grass and everything. And this is one of the greatest stories. What happened was the people who were guarding this, they didn't let the people around it know because they would eat the seeds. They ate food. But they guarded it. Several of them died of starvation guarding the seeds.
Mm-hmm.
Guarding the seeds. And the seeds are still there. And a couple of years ago, there were some problems with that institute with the present government. But it's an incredible story that these people, they didn't know that Vavilov was taken and they didn't know he had died. But they did it. It was 1943, 44. They died of starvation guarding the seeds.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yep.
It's an incredible story.
Certainly is. Yep.
Well, I'm curious if, do you do genetic testing to determine exactly this is that seed historically, or
Well,
how do you know?
we don't have the capability to do any kind of DNA testing ourselves. And if we did, you'd also need a second sample that you were comparing it against. You'd need to have a sample of that known variety. So with the historic commercial varieties in our collection, for example, we will use the data collected during an evaluation grow out to compare that against the physical characteristics that are supposed to be exhibited. And if we feel like it's a reasonable match and it came to us with the name and the description matches that name, then we feel pretty confident that it is that variety. But there are a couple of crops where we are starting to look at DNA testing. Our potato collection is one example of that. Potatoes are a little bit like apples. They are typically propagated by a vegetative portion of the plant. So you plant a potato, you dig it, you replant it, you dig it, you replant it. It remains unchanged. And with potatoes, as they are marketed and sold over the centuries, sometimes synonyms arise for a variety. It might be called one name in New York, it might have a different name in California. And we know that we have examples of the same variety under different names in our collection, and we're trying to definitely identify those and weed out the redundant duplicates, essentially, because potatoes they do require a fair amount of resources to maintain in tissue culture, and we really only need one example of a variety, even if it has 5 different names. So the potatoes are something that we are working with, and University of Wisconsin in Madison has been helping out with that. They can do testing. We've also had some interest from the University of Minnesota in our apple collection because of this similar type of situation. And I think we are hopefully going to get perhaps some action moving forward on that. So apples are just rife with synonyms as well, as they have been traveled and replanted and named for the farmer, named for a location. Yep. So, yes.
Just curious, ballpark, do you have any idea on what percentage of submissions to Seed Savers are considered unique enough and have a compelling enough story to add to your collection?
Well, one thing I actually realized I just didn't touch on was the fact that the story is what makes it unique to us. And if we have a bean in the collection, if we have Connecticut Wonder bean that came from this family and has this history of stewardship with them, as long as there's 20 years of stewardship and we can fill in enough of those names and dates and places and get a sense of its history, that is enough for us to bring it in, because really inclusion in our collection is all based on the history and what we know about it. If another family contacts us and they have something called Connecticut Wonder, I keep goofing that name up, it might be different, maybe it's the same variety, but if there is a different story of how that family has used it, how they've shared it, then we would consider keeping both. Maybe not 2 different samples from brothers and the variety is that closely related, but there is a large number of beans in our collection called some variation of goose bean, wild goose bean, turkey craw bean, beans that have been found actually in the gizzards of various different fowl. My favorite is the Mosteller wild goose bean from Pennsylvania. After the Civil War, 2 brothers were out on the family mill race and shot a goose, brought it to their mother for supper, and she cleaned it and found the beans that had been still stuck in its throat. And they ended up saving those seeds and replanting them. But we have other examples in the collection of that near exact same story from Tennessee, from Kentucky, from Indiana. It's an interesting example how resourceful people have been in the past. But all of those individual stories are essentially what gives that variety its character and its identity, and knowing the relationships between those people to that variety is what makes it special ultimately. So, yeah, we receive about, I would say easily 50 to 75 people contact us every year looking to potentially donate something to our collection. So we correspond with them and try to collect as much information as possible so that we do have a well-rounded picture of what the variety looks like when they come time to send seeds to us. So, did I see your hand in the back?
Yeah. So who makes a determination to bring seed variety out of the vault into the catalog for public purchase? Is there demand for that particular seed? Or?
Not always demand, although we are, let's see, we have separate staff who work on the catalog and another group of staff who work strictly on the collection, the seed bank collection. And we are in the process of actually evaluating what is in the catalog. Are there some gaps? Are there certain types of crops that we either don't sell, or maybe we need to start offering well, I think we do have a scorzonera. There are some crops I'd never heard of before. But we want the catalog to reflect the seed bank collection. And when we can identify a gap or a niche that we haven't been offering lately, we will take a look at what has the evaluation team noticed recently that really stood out to them. One thing I'm excited about is a pepper from the seed bank collection from a family in Arkansas where they started growing it during the Great Depression. And it is I would call it an ornamental pepper. The foliage of the plant is a really intense purple, and the peppers themselves are very, very small, but intensely hot. So it was used as combination ornamental plant in the flower beds, but the peppers could be harvested, put in vinegar, and used as a condiment in different recipes and things. Well,
I'm making a list.
it won't be available in the catalog for a couple of years, but it's called Grandma Kirksey. Kirksey. It is a beautiful pepper. I think people are going to want to grow it as much for the aesthetic as for being able to eat it too. So we try to regularly swap out things from the catalog and keep it fresh and new. And the evaluation program is one way that it helps us identify those things.
So when you're looking at releasing something from the vault into the catalog, is that the seed that was in the vault, is that grown out in the field to get a bunch of seeds? Or?
Yes, we do typically only keep a small quantity of seeds of any given variety in our freezer storage. And if it were to be placed into the catalog, it definitely takes a year, sometimes 2 years or 3 years, depending on the productivity of that particular variety, because we will need to bulk up the quantity of seed that we have. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How many new varieties do you get a year on average?
Donations into the seed bank collection?
Accepted.
Well, it varies. I would say that it typically numbers around 25, maybe 50, maybe. But in our catalog, we try to bring in a couple dozen new varieties every year into that mix. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, this might seem silly, but I'm just wondering about all these stories. And are there any threads connecting from the seeds to like genealogy search? Or, like, oh, did my family ever have heirloom seeds? How would I ever know if nobody told me a story?
Right, right. I think that it might be hard, it would probably be very hard to identify something from your own family unless it fell in your lap. But I think that the seed stories are one way that people can connect to their heritage. So if you know you have ancestors from certain areas of the world or countries, that might be one way for you to reconnect with varieties that could be similar to what they once would have grown. My family doesn't have any seeds that were passed down, so I live vicariously through the collection and through the work at Seed Savers Exchange. I did discover a bean that came to the United States from Germany, from a town in Germany that was probably no more than 50 miles away from where some of my own ancestors had left. So being able to identify seeds that came from places near to where your own families have grown might be one way to go about that.
Is that like searchable on your online site? Are the stories accessible to everybody on your online site?
The stories of the varieties that we offer in the exchange every year are online, and you can search for those. We don't have the entire seed bank collection searchable through, like, say, our website itself. But that is functionality that I would really be interested in trying to figure out how to make that happen. Because the stories are engaging and they capture people's imagination, and it would be wonderful to make that information a little more accessible. Mm-hmm.
Are there other people at Seed Savers Exchange that are doing exactly what you're doing? Help you develop these stories, because you're a historian. I expect there aren't too many historians on this panel.
No. I don't know if there are too many other seed historians in the United States, period. Currently, I'm the only full-time staff member, although we have received grant funding in recent years to help us hire, say, a full-time position for 1 year to work on a specific project or aspect of the collection. Yeah, for the most part, it's just me. So
I'm sure there are other people that are interested in this without the expertise
definitely.
to help you and support the mission that you're.
Right, yes. There's a couple of folks who actually participate in the exchange, and yesterday I received an email from him saying, I saw on Facebook where somebody was talking about this such and such bean, and I think it would be great for your collection, and they provided a lot of information, and I'm really excited to follow up with that on Monday when I get back to work. So, yep. Well, thank you very much for your attention and for coming today. It's been wonderful to be here, and looking forward to the garden walk afterwards. So, thanks.